Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for joining us, where we're going to check in with the challenges facing public higher education. But first, yes, Pennsylvania has a new Speaker of the House, and let's also check in on the incoming administration, I should say gubernatorial administration, of Josh Shapiro, back after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, unlike what's going on in the nation's capital, Pennsylvania was able to elect a new Speaker of the House in an unusual compromise that was worked out. Joining me to talk about that and the incoming administration of Josh Shapiro, Stephen Caruso, he's the Capitol reporter with Spotlight PA, and Tom Lehman, he's the Capitol reporter with WGAL News 8. All right, Tom, I'll tell you, it was a huge surprise. Numbers really mattered here, I think. Which party will control the House and for how long?
Well, I think that's a more complicated question than a simple answer, really. But Mark Rozzi, the representative and elected Democrat from Berks County, is your new Speaker of the House in Pennsylvania. And the big, interesting part of his acceptance of this role is that he said he's not going to caucus with Democrats or Republicans, which of course makes things really interesting right now because the margins are so close. You've got 101 Republicans compared to 99 Democrats, and that's going to change soon. So the chamber is really in flux, and it's a really interesting time to be covering the Capitol.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, when we talk about I'm going to be an independent, we're not yet sure, as this show airs, whether he's actually going to change his voter registration. The representative was elected as a Democrat in a Democratic city, Reading, in Berks County. So he could say, I'm going to act as an independent, and as Tom just pointed out, not caucus with either the D's or the R's, but keep his voter registration Democratic. Could he not?
I mean, he could, and this kind of gets at how all of this is nebulous. All we have is basically Mark Rozzi's speech when he was, after being nominated by Republicans, was voted as a speaker by Democrats and Republican leadership, which doesn't happen too often. And then he gave remarks who said, I'm now an independent, and then he spoke very briefly to the press, flanked by Democratic leadership, and that's it. Republicans are saying the chamber is now 101, 101, or will be once it's filled out. Democrats are saying, oh, no, he's the Democratic speaker because he's an elected Democrat. And Mark Rozzi just given a speech where he said he's independent. So everyone's kind of saying and looking at this and seeing what they want, a Rorschach test, if you will. And so we're still in wait and see, but it's going to be, there's still so many things that have to change. You know, Rozzi's going to have to set the rules for the chamber, which are going to say who has the real power to call up a bill for a vote. And that's going to be sort of where the rubber meets the road of, like, who is actually in charge.
But the fact of the matter is there are 3 special elections that are now going to be held on February 7th in Democratic districts. So it looks like the Democrats will have 102, the Republicans 101, if I got this correctly. And we have a Democratic speaker, but 102 to 101 on any given day, who knows which party's going to be in the majority, right?
Sure, and I think going back to what we were just talking about here, that is really the question here, because Mark Rozzi, again, has said he's not going to caucus with either side. Whether he changes his registration or not, does that matter? Do Democrats have the number of votes they need to push through a particular motion or piece of legislation? If he's not caucusing with them, can he be considered a sure vote on the caucus's priorities? I think that's the really big question here, because, again, whether he has an I or a D next to his name, it really matters how he votes.
And really any member. It's been said that, like, when you're at a 1-vote margin like this, every man's a king, or every representative's a king. And, so same thing. If Republicans think they can get Rozzi on an issue, but then one of their members defects, now they're right back where they started from.
Yeah. And it looks like this is, I mean, we're going to have one of those moments, I think, right, where which party actually has the majority and what does it mean and what happens when legislation moves along. We're going to talk about the Governor-Elect Shapiro in a moment, but the fact of the matter is that, we've had a situation before like this back in 2007, but we're in a totally new, I would just say, in a new era here.
Right, and I think the big issue here is going to be every single vote from here on out over the next 2 years. It doesn't matter whether it's Mark Rozzi as Speaker, whether they reshuffle that position again once the Democrats are able to fill out their ranks. I think the real question that's going to come up for every single vote, every single motion, do you have your votes lined up or not? All
right, we're going to run to a break. I'll tell you, this is a little confusing for even those who like us who follow it. All right, coming up, we're going to talk about Josh Shapiro. He's the governor-elect. What's going on with his incoming administration?
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, Stephen. Josh Shapiro wins a big victory, 15 points. He also has an approach unlike what we've seen in governors in recent history, and that's the bipartisan nature of his approach. He has a transition team of over 300 people with many Democrats, many Republicans, business and labor. And now in the early stages of his administration, meaning as he prepares to take office on January 17, we're seeing that approach playing out in cabinet appointments and his general approach to being governor.
Yeah, it's when you looked at Josh Shapiro's campaign that he won, he really tried to appeal to Republicans. He really tried to appeal to Republicans who felt turned off by Doug Mastriano, his opponent, who was, he painted as an extremist. And now looking at how he's governing and how he's preparing to govern, that's carrying over. Today, for instance, Shapiro announced that his Secretary of State, so this is the person who runs basically oversees elections, is going to be Al Schmidt. He's a former Philadelphia city commissioner who oversaw Philadelphia elections, and he's a Republican. Now, he's a Republican who many in the party have sort of disowned. Donald Trump was slamming him on social media after the 2020 election because Schmidt was very vocally saying the 2020 election was not stolen. Our elections are run safely and fairly, and we do our best. And so he kind of became a champion of the anti-stop the steal movement, if you will. But so the pick in some ways is like, if I had to guess, how would Shapiro try to reach across the aisle with a really important pick? Like Secretary of State's probably the most important pick he can make. I mean, Schmidt may kind of make sense for him.
Yeah. And by the way, 2 cabinet secretaries announced, one Democrat, one Republican. I mean, so he's going to carry that approach out to the operation of his administration, day-to-day operation of his administration.
Sure. And this is something he said he was going to do from the very beginning.
Yeah.
He was going to build that coalition. He was going to bring that into, the policy performance that he's going to be putting up during this 4-year term. He's going to be having a lot of different voices surrounding him, not just Democrats, but Republicans. And, ultimately, how that interacts with the legislature, how that interacts with the public looking in on the actions he's taking. I think that this is something where it's that coalition he'd been talking about the whole time. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah. And when we get down to some of the policy issues, obviously, the one thing he has made clear over and over again, and he will continue to do what Governor Wolf has done, which is veto any bill that comes to his desk that changes or weakens Pennsylvania's Abortion Control Act.
Yeah, that's been a very clear red line for Shapiro. He's also thrown out, bills that might restrict voting access. Like, he's going to oppose any attempt to get rid of Act 77, our mail-in ballot law. He's also said he's going to protect union rights in the same way. So, what Shapiro said he's going to do, kind of like Wolf, he wants to put more funding in education.
Right.
He also, and this is somewhat opposed to Wolf, has said that he is willing to deal on charter schools or expanding access to private schools, school choice. And that's something I'm sort of looking for, because that is a bargaining chip that if he is actually willing to sign a bill that does expand that, that's something that he could go to Republican legislators who are very pro alternatives to public schools and maybe get some deal done with.
Yeah. And finally to you, I mean, if anybody looks like they can work with people in the other party in this, and you cover the legislature, so you know how partisan everything is, it looks like it's Governor-Elect Shapiro.
Sure, and I think just discussions with lawmakers that I've had around the Capitol, they've said he's got a D next to his name, he is a Democrat, but there might be more room for negotiation than we found with Tom Wolf, and I think that's going to be a dynamic that we may see playing out with some big compromises, some big legislation that maybe Governor Wolf couldn't get done.
It's going to be a real test. We're going to see. All right, thanks for the update. All right, coming up, we're going to take a look at public higher education. Yes, the students are back, and they're coming back for I call it the spring semester. We'll call it whatever it is, winter and spring semester, back after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
All right, we're going to talk about the challenges facing public higher education. Joining me to do this is Dr. Ken Mash. He's the president of the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, otherwise known as APSCUF. All right, Ken, 90,000 students, 14 public universities spread throughout the state of Pennsylvania. Before we talk about the system changes and the challenges, these universities are extremely important to the regions in which they are located in a whole variety of ways.
Yeah, they absolutely are. I mean, in terms of employing people, we're talking about places like Clarion, Pennsylvania. As far as who's the biggest employer there,
right.
our universities and I should say campuses now, because we have 10 campuses because of the consolidation. But the campuses really are like the biggest employers in their counties. So when the universities get affected, it impacts the entire community. It impacts even things like the housing stock, right? So if they start reducing the staff and reducing the faculty at these universities, what happens ultimately is people are moving, it's lowering the cost of housing, and it winds up impacting the entire community in terms of the value of housing and also taxes.
Point.
And also taxes.
Yeah.
So, we have communities that are now struggling with their taxes and may have to ultimately wind up raising taxes because they're losing revenue.
Well, the universities also require a whole variety of services that get supplied by the people who live and work in these various communities, services and goods, among other things.
Oh, of course. So, it's not just the people who work directly, as you're pointing out, at the universities. It's also those people who are servicing the university, which are often from the community. But certainly, even if they're not from the community, they are in the Commonwealth, and therefore it's an impact on the entire Commonwealth.
All right, let's talk about some of the changes that have occurred that, I'll be candid with you, that are controversial. Changes in the state system. I keep saying 14 public universities. It's hard for me not to say that.
I appreciate that. I often still say 14 because it's always been 14 or 14 for the longest time. But we do have 10 universities at this point. 6 universities were merged into 2.
6 into 2.
Into 2, and that, of course, it creates problems. It creates anxiety. There are real issues as far as trying to merge curriculum together, administration, the various different jobs that have to get done, and making sure that things are running smoothly at each one of the campuses that are there. And it's been difficult. The thing that gives me confidence is I know that our faculty are, they're great, and that they have gone above and beyond to try and make this work the best that they can for the students. The problem is that's exhausting, right? To keep doing that year after year, and we're really starting to drain people as we move forward.
And you also have a tuition freeze this year, right?
Well, it looks like we're going to have a tuition freeze. It's been, I think rightfully so, a concern of the chancellor and the board to make sure that we are affordable. That's part of our mission, is to be affordable. But to remain affordable, we really need the commitment of the Commonwealth to step up, because we're state-owned universities. So we don't have some of the resources that other universities have.
Well, as I mentioned in an earlier segment, there's over I think it's something like $3.7 billion in surplus. So it looks like when the incoming governor, Shapiro, makes a recommendation that it should be pretty positive for the public universities.
And my overarching concern, in part because of these consolidations, is we took universities that had debt and we combined them together, so we just have a bigger debt. But the reality is that that debt was incurred oftentimes by poor decisions by administrators to build fancy dorms and things like that. If the Commonwealth doesn't step in, we have a continuing process where the students are picking up, the current students at those universities are picking up the cost of that debt. Also, it's just not sustainable. And
all right, we're going to transfer from changes to some of the challenges that these universities find themselves in.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
All right, Ken Mash, let's shift from the changes that have occurred to the challenges that the public universities face.
Yeah, well, so we have, of course, a number of challenges. One of those is enrollment, which is not just an issue for the state system, but is an issue for the entire ecosystem of higher education. And the reason for that is that at least it looks like there's going to be a declining number of high school graduates, which means that there's going to be fewer students who are attending college. Now, the challenge, I think, is that we have in Pennsylvania, we don't have that many people with degrees, which is kind of surprising given the opportunities that are there.
And how many colleges and universities?
Yeah, we have, we're the 4th highest as far as the number of colleges and universities, which, by the way, is a great thing. It's really a reason to attract, if it's done correctly, to attract people to the Commonwealth. But we have a number of adult learners that we can service. We also, particularly in north central Pennsylvania, there's a real dearth of students filling out the FAFSA form. So we're leaving federal money on the table because they're not even filling out the FAFSA form. So they don't even, and that's the financial aid form. So they don't even know what opportunities are available to them. So the Commonwealth, we and the Commonwealth together need to do a better job of reaching out to those students to make sure that they fill out the forms. Yeah,
and you talked a little bit about these consolidations. Quite frankly, I'm not sure I completely understand why they're being done, but you still think that's a challenge, correct?
Well, yeah. Well, our ABSCUF, didn't really understand why it was being done as well, except that there was kind of a push for change, and this is change, I suppose. But it is a challenge because it means coordinating 3 different campuses into one university. It also means being attractive, a challenge as far as remaining attractive to students to pick any of those 6 campuses when they have other choices. So that we have to figure out how it is and what the benefit of those consolidated universities are. And there can be benefits. And there are right now some benefits of doing it, but we have to be able to articulate those to the students. Okay,
how about program cuts?
Well, there, with regard as we lose students, as the money has dried up, too, we have seen a number of program cuts, and it's part of our frustration. Is we see this as, it could be a downward spiral, right? So you're already suffering as far as enrollments go, but the more programs you cut, the less attractive you are for students to come. So, it becomes this never-ending downward spiral. So, this is why we're pushing very hard to get more money for the system. We're pushing very hard to do these other things that will attract students to the system so that we could sort of break out of that cycle.
Yeah. Before we go on, I want to point out that I'm an alum of one of these universities, Millersville University, and I was on the faculty at Millersville University for more years than I'm willing to admit, something like 37 and a half years, and I'm back now as a senior fellow, so I just want to point that out. So
you left something out, too, as far as ABSCUF.
Yeah, I'm president of ABSCUF, so we need to make sure that all this gets out there. All right, let's talk about hiring, retrenchment, the hiring of faculty. Can you hire them back? And it's just not obviously faculty, but others have been laid off as well, correct?
Right. Correct. So we have faced retrenchment. We still have some faculty at Lock Haven University who are holding these so-called intent to retrench letters. We had a big number of faculty retrenched at Indiana University. Again, we see this not as a solution as far as retrenching faculty, laying people off, because, as I said before, you start that downward spiral. It's the universities themselves become less attractive. You demoralize the people who work there, and therefore they're not pushing as hard as they can to make the university grow.
But having said that, in less than a minute, but you're cautiously optimistic. I like that.
Well, I am cautiously optimistic, largely because of Governor Shapiro. And I do think that he is someone who is familiar with higher education, understands the benefits of having the universities that we do in each of the sectors. And I think that he's going to try and push us in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, look, I want to thank you for the update. It's very, very important, and we'll see you soon.
It's a pleasure.
All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, you stay well.